for part 3 of our season finale. I mean, we'll still have 2 more weeks of work, but this is the last official class of the Methods and Approaches class for this semester, a semester that has been atypical, to say the least. Let's just say atypical, because I'm recording and this is gonna be on YouTube. I have a better word for that, but I don't want the video, I don't want this video to be rated R. So I'll keep it to myself for this one. I'm very excited for everyone to introduce 2 incredible scholars, and I keep saying that every week, but it's the truth. 2 incredible scholars and very good friends in Professors Zhongfeng Tian and Idalia Nuñez. I've had a chance to work with both of them separately on similar topics, so that's why I invited them, because I know they work on the topic we're gonna discuss today from different perspectives, but still converging. So quickly introduce Idalia, Dr. Idalia Nuñez. She's an assistant professor at the University of Illinois, so that for me is always an extra reason to be happy to have a professor coming from my alma mater and joining us in the conversation today. And Zhongfeng is finishing his PhD at Boston College, but he already will be joining the ranks of the University of Texas San Antonio in the fall. And they're very lucky to have an incredible scholar who's already, and both of them have an incredible track record of publications, book chapters, peer-reviewed articles. Zhongfeng already has 1 book that he recently published. And I imagine, knowing his track record, he's probably working on his 2nd or 3rd book by now. He's probably, he just won't tell us, but I'm pretty sure that's the case with Zhongfeng. I mean, their track record is impressive. I mean, I could spend half an hour just telling you how awesome they are, but then you'll get a chance to hear them talking about the topic for today. So I invited Zhongfeng and Idalia because I want to introduce a conversation that is happening in the field of literacy. And I gotta remind. So I want to introduce a topic that there is a lot of ongoing debates and conversations about, and that is this conversation about ideas related to translanguaging, code switching, code mixing, and other related terms that may escape my mind. I like to bring that to this conversation in the Conceptual language classroom because in the historical context, in the field of language teaching, and I'm very sure Zhonfeng in particular, because he's in TESOL, he knows a little bit about this. We've always had a very contentious relationship between the L1, the mother language, and the L2, the second language, or additional language, or foreign language, however you want to frame it. We've always had this contentious relationship that sometimes it's like a love and hate relationship, or an on-again, off-again relationship. So it's like a really weird, complicated relationship with those 2 languages. Where we have ranged from basically forbidding students to speak the L1 in the second language classroom to other comments. And that is under a lot of debate. And in that debate is that ideas about translanguaging, code mixing, code switching are appearing. And I think it's important for students to understand that this is a debate that is happening, that is a debate that is far from settled, that I would say in the field of language studies in general has been going on for several years, but in TESOL in general, it's still a recent event. There are people in Colombia who are starting to do that kind of work, but it's still, in general, the work is very much in its infancy. So with that, I just want to engage in a conversation. So this is not again, it's a very webinar style, very unscripted, more like relying on the research and the experience and the work that our distinguished guests have done in their own fields, in their own publications, and in their own studies. So they can give us an idea what those terms mean and why it's important to talk about it, and why should young teachers like the ones I have in the class, even consider that this needs to be part of their teaching and instructional practices. So without that introduction, I'm gonna leave the room entirely to Zhongfeng and Idalia for them to talk about their ideas and engage in conversation. As always, to the students, if you have any questions, you're welcome to raise your hand. You're welcome to leave your questions in the chat. If you don't want to open the microphone, we'll read the questions and we'll discuss them. So, folks, we're all yours.
Italia, I don't know if you want to go first.
I mean, I'm okay with, if there's specific questions we want to address, however the students want to start the conversation.
Well, I would just jump in because I can legitimately say I don't think students, for some of the students, these terms may be very well the first time they've ever heard them. The conversation about translanguaging in Colombia is still very, very recent. I can give you a little more context. I think I've only heard people talking about translanguaging in the past maybe 3 years. That I know that at least there are, because I know there is a professor in Pereira who wrote a dissertation that was about translanguaging. I know there's another professor in Bogota who's published about translanguaging, and that's as far as I know. So, and I know there is a few minor studies, but there is very little still. And the conversations about code mixing and code switching, they are being sparse, but not very consistent. So, in the case of the students, I insist, I don't think if you ask them right now what they would understand by any of those terms, they will probably, you would get a lot of blank faces with good reason because the conversation is just emerging. So if you want to start maybe by explaining a little bit what those terms mean and why and we can just take the conversation from there.
Okay. Well, I'll talk to you a little bit about how I think of the term translanguaging. And anybody feel free to stop me, interrupt, jump in. I don't want to be just talking by myself. So I really want to encourage a conversation. So I'm a bilingual and I speak Spanish and English, and I speak Spanglish, and I speak all these other variations that you'll find on the border. Growing up, I lived in Texas, in the Texas borderlands, which very much meant I crossed the border all the time, almost on a daily basis. So I went to Mexico, I lived in Mexico, I have family in Mexico, we still have a home in Mexico. And so I went a lot back and forth. So with that experience, I came to really grow up as a bilingual, very biculturally. And when the term translanguaging emerged, I think I was able to identify with it at a personal level. I was able to see, how this term sort of conceptualized even my own personal experience differently. So it's really about, for me, it's really about thinking of language as part of the person, as part of the context, and also in very political ways. So to back up a little bit too, I wanted to explain that growing up, experiencing expectations in two countries very much said I have to focus, in the US, it was very much an educational experience, and I had to focus a lot on the standard form of English that was valued in my school. Whereas in Mexico, I was constantly receiving these messages about the standard form of Spanish. And so those were things I had to navigate as a bilingual. So translanguaging, in a way, is saying, let's disrupt those ideas about standardization. Let's disrupt that notion of what is valued, what is academic, what is the appropriate way of speaking a certain language. To me, this disrupts this idea that we hold emerging bilinguals to this bar, this standard bar that was set by someone that in a lot of ways is unrealistic and unachievable. Whereas translanguaging is more of, okay, this is what you have, this is what you've seen, this is what you've learned, this is your linguistic repertoire, is who you are, it's part of your identity, it's part of the way you read the world, the way you experience the world, the way you respond to it as well. So for me, translanguaging kind of gave the space to see language in a more humanizing way, not as a tool, not necessarily as a way of measuring people, but just as a way of being, as part of who we are. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. I'm kind of tying it here to personal experiences versus research, but I wanted to kind of give you my own perspective on it.
Before I give, because I really want to hear Zhongfeng's perspective. I mean, I think I want to really add, and this is one for students, it's very, that moment, that the personal dimension is very important. And I think for, especially because again, we're talking about students who next semester are going to start thinking of their own research projects for, I mean, their senior thesis, and some of the students are already part of some of our student research labs. And so they're going to be trying to confront conceptual frameworks as part of their own work. That personal dimension is important, and kind of like say that, yeah, we arrive at conceptual frameworks because that is something that resonates with them, and something that, and we can say that we can use conceptual frameworks as ways to also make sense of our own life experiences as we translate those life experiences as scholars. So I really appreciated that, linking it to the personal dimension.
Mm-hmm.
So, Zhonfeng?
Sure, yeah. I think for me, also similar to what Idalia just said, in one sentence, translanguaging is my lived experience, which is how bilinguals use their languages or multiple languages in a more fluid and flexible way to make sense, to communicate with each other, and to get their meaning across to different people based on different contexts. So just sharing a little bit more about my personal story, because also translanguaging really resonated with my on a personal dimension as well. So I grew up in China. So, and I learned English as a foreign language. So there's always the term, you know, in TESOL field, we have ESL, EFL. So those, when the terms coming out in the field, like, so I was sort of identified as a EFL speaker, right? So English language learner in that traditional sense. And there's always this kind of standard you got to achieve to speak like a native speaker, right? You need to reduce your accent, because when you speak English, you don't sound like how a white, you know, person talks. You need to mimic how they speak, how they write academic English sentences. So there's always this kind of standardized language ideology circulating in teaching, in research, in TESOL, this kind of field. And then when I came to the US, after I finished my undergraduate studies in China. So for my master degree at Boston University for a TESOL degree. So still I can see there's a lot of monolingual bias underlying this TESOL whole field, which is like what I said, accent reduction, and how do you write normal or appropriate English discourses in certain contexts. So those kind of constraints that that is still haunted by many non-native English speakers. And then I encountered this concept of translanguaging when I was a first-year doctoral student. And I think first, the translanguaging really captured my heart is it really legitimizes how we speak and how we make meaning, how we make sense in everyday lives, which is, it's completely normal to say, to mix your languages in that way based on different factors, based on different interlocutors. When you talk to different people, it's okay to speak like Chinglish or Spanglish, right? Those traditional terms with very negative terms, because that's just who we are, right? How we make sense in our everyday lives. That's just how we use languages in a creative and critical ways to challenge the monolingual dominant structure. So I think translanguaging normalizes how bilinguals or multilinguals speak in that sense. And learning the concept and even researching the concept of translanguaging for me is a very self-affirmation and self-empowerment process. So it sort of gives me confidence that I no longer treat myself just as English language learner. I should call myself as a bilingual speaker, even multilingual speaker. I speak Mandarin, Cantonese, and English, instead of just always looking myself or my language resources from a deficit point of view. So I think that part really captured my heart. Like Idalia just said, the political aspect, right? The social justice aspect, the empowerment aspect, I think really speaks to me. So that's why I gained much more interest in translanguaging, and I want to carry this passion to my teaching as well. So I think in especially in English language teaching class, we always label those students as English language learners in the traditional sense. But from a translanguaging lens, they are not just English language learners, they are emerging bilinguals. We should value what they already have, which is their L1 or home languages as resources, and we should cultivate a space that strategically leverage their home language resources in teaching or in English language teaching in our context, so that we can cultivate their positive bilingual identity, but also help them to navigate academic English and even develop a critical mind to even challenge what academic language is in that sense. So that's just how I understand the terms and why it really matters to me.
Oh, wow, I mean, that's no, and I really appreciate again from the two of you how you connect the concepts to your personal experiences growing up. I mean, especially in the case of language, I think it's difficult not to develop frameworks and not connect it to your own personal experience, because learning a language is actually just dealing with the language as part of your everyday life. So, and there are so many things that you talked about that I really, well, one thing I really want to that resonates a lot, and I will save my comment for later because one of the students raised her hand and I want to leave them, I mean, listen to them. So Anna, you can go ahead.
Oh, hi. Thank you very much for coming to the class, to the two of you first. My question is, you have talked about like your experiences from your home language to English. So I had this question about, can you talk about translanguaging when you talk about like a native English speaker who has like sort of a mark in the way they speak English? So for example, someone, I don't know, I'm going to make a weird example, like someone who comes from the Bronx and goes to a very high level English school, that person can experience translanguaging as well. Would that be incorporated in the term or not? I don't know if it's clear, the question.
Well, I think the question is clear. I just want to hear what Zhonfeng and Idalia have to say in that regard.
Sorry, I was writing down the question, make sure I didn't miss the yeah, I think it is translanguaging. One of the things that I've heard Ofelia Garcia talk about is everybody does translanguaging. It looks different. It just looks different from person to person. So the example you gave about maybe someone who speaks English but is from the Bronx. So here we have to think about the person and the multiple spaces that they participate, to think about that's the way I conceptualize it, right? So if you think about the person and the spaces they participate, the people that they surround themselves with, how do they use language to navigate all of that? And so whether it's a different language or maybe a variety of a language. So here we talk about the term of English as Englishes too. So there's multiple ways that we represent English across communities, across spaces. So translanguaging would look different. So even for a native English speaker, I would say they're translanguaging when maybe they communicate with different people from different spaces. So the way they communicate in the Bronx versus outside of the Bronx. That's a form of also recognizing that they're moving fluidly with their language, making reading the space that they're in, reading the people that they're talking to, and changing their linguistic repertoire to maybe communicate in a different way. That's how I see it. So even just across spaces, or even a native English speaker is doing translanguaging. Does that make sense? Does that help answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I think I would agree with what Idalia just said, because translanguaging, I think one of the important notions undergirding translanguaging, this concept, is it tries to disrupt this kind of standardized notion of one named language. So if we look at from that lens, English is not a monolithic entity either. So English, it contains varieties of features that. So what is English? There's no standard answer, right? There's no there's one thing called English, and there's one purest identity as English there already existed. So languages are socially constructed. So it's who people, it's how we people or people use language identify what language is. So translanguaging looks at language as a social practice, how we make sense, how we interact with people, how we communicate our meaning in social context is what really matters, and how we do language. In that sense, language can be a verb, right? So languaging is a verb. We are constantly languaging all the time, and we are also constantly translanguaging all the time from context to context. So we will select different linguistic features from our language repertoire or our language resources to make sense to communicate. So when a person who grew up from Bronx, when he or she enters to a different context, of course, the person will draw upon different features of English to make sense, to communicate his or her ideas. So I think that is also sort of considered an act of translanguaging. Yeah.
Thank you very much to the two of you.
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and I think really there is a lot there to continue dissecting, because I mean the whole idea, as Zhonfeng was saying, English is not monolithic, or any language for that matter. I don't think we can consider languages as this monolith, as this one single thing that is indivisible or that you cannot break it in any way. No, when there are so many nuances to language use. Definitely, I would like to go a little bit deeper because Zhonfeng, you brought this up, this idea of languaging. And kind of, because I think it's important to explain, and I mean, in yesterday's class, we talked a little bit about that. One, I mean, that language and languaging are not necessarily the same thing. So what would languaging mean exactly to you?
I think languaging, I think it first comes from we treat language not just as one named language entity, not just as an existing object there. Language as a verb, right? So languaging is the progressive form of language as a verb, which means it's the continuous ongoing process of meaning negotiation and communicating in social context. So that's what it really means to me, languaging. So right now I'm languaging, right? I'm drawing upon my English features to convey my meanings. This is how I am languaging in this class. So languaging will also look very differently in different contexts, right? So right now how I am languaging will different. Maybe after this class, when I meet my bilingual friends, how I languaging will be different. I can draw upon more language features to language my thoughts. So that's what really means. So languaging, again, it looks at language from a social practice lens, and it focuses more on the speaker's agency, not just on the certain rules, the standardization of named languages. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with that. Is this idea of seeing, one, thinking about language when we use the word language as a noun, as a thing that we can, sometimes when we think of language, you know, in research, we think about it as an object of study, versus languaging is something that we see more as it's continuous, it's always evolving, and it's something that we do, that we embody, which is something also tied to multimodality, where it's not just the oral or the spoken or the written form, but all these other ways that we embody language, that we're always languaging and using, even right now, just on my hand gestures. All of that is part of my own linguistic repertoire. This is how I feel I can communicate to you better my ideas. And Raul, do you mind if I show a quick example? It's like a 10-second.
Not at all. Go ahead, by all means, please.
I like to use this clip to show just how multimodal languaging is. But let me share the screen. And let me raise the volume. Okay, do y'all see the PowerPoint? Let me do this. Okay, so this is, just to preface or give a little bit of context, this is a student in a second grade classroom, and he's bilingual. And so the person who's reaching out to ask a question automatically addresses him in Spanish. And then he tries to answer very briefly the question, but I want you to look at everything he does to answer this question.
¿Qué es lo que ustedes piensan? Que tenemos que tener muchos galones de glue y se lo pegamos y después puede ser bien pegajoso y después cuando podemos también como caminar en el
So that's like a very quick example of his languaging. But just to ask everybody in the group to kind of get us going, you know, what did you all see? What did you notice about how he was answering or using his language?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I would like to see the students. I mean, think about, again, everything that you noticed in the video. And again, think about everything the students did. Because once you get into the heart of that, you start thinking of everything they did. That is going to get you to the heart of what languaging is.
Yeah, I can play it again. It's very, I mean, I kind of preface like how fast it is, but it really is really short and fast the way, but I'll play it again so that we all can relook at it and think about it.
¿Qué es lo que ustedes piensan? Que tenemos que tener muchos galones de glue y se lo pegamos y después puede ser bien pegajoso y después cuando podemos también como caminar en el
So what do you all think?
Any ideas? While we give the students a couple of minutes to think, I would say the first thing is actually in order to really make sense of this, you will have to pay attention to even the body language itself. I mean, if you just, for example, you just listen to the audio and would not see the video, you would be missing a lot of cues that really help construct the meaning. And I think that's at the heart of the idea of languaging. That languaging really tells us that when you language, and I really love the idea of language as a verb and not as a noun that Zhonfeng introduced in his intervention. Really, you have to understand that the spoken word or the written word just become, and I like the idea of languaging, thinking of the idea of multimodality that Idalia introduced, in this idea of resources. The idea of meaning, of semiotic and linguistic and aesthetic resources for meaning making. Because again, for the students who are not, I mean, they are familiar with the idea of multimodality, but they might not get it so well. It's the idea of how multiple resources come together to make meaning. So in the process of languaging, everything we do as part of that, as part of the actions, as you said, moving your thing, I mean, you know, moving the, even in the sense of the video, the whole discussion of the video itself is a languaging moment, where the video is a resource, and then but Idalia's words are another resource, and then the body language and the questions that we elicit are another resource. So when you put it all together, that's when meaning making begins. And I think one of the things I appreciate about the notion of languaging is that it's telling you, listen, there are so many resources available to language that just limited itself to the word, it's never going to be enough, because you need the verbal cues, you need the not, I mean, you need to, I mean, even in a conversation, when someone nods their head, I mean, that's a verbal sign that maybe I can keep going. Or, I mean, even in an everyday conversation, we react to verbal cues, we react to physical cues, we react to something as simple as what we talked about when you learn phonetics, intonation. Intonation, sometimes we take it for granted, but it's so, because intonation really gives you, it becomes a series of verbal cues about, is my discourse going the right direction? Are people engaged? Or should I just definitely stop because maybe my intonation did not elicit a response, and maybe that's for me, like, okay, maybe I need to back off. So there are so many elements in that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, looking at the video, I think, like you said, if we were just listening to the audio, how much of that conversation and even of the message the student is trying to convey would be missing, right? So there you see him negotiating. Well, someone is addressing me in Spanish, and he's using Spanish, but then there's certain words that he used his translanguaging, he used English, but then ended up, supplementing. Well, glue and sealing, and so he ended up, adding to his languaging by making it more multimodal. And I think that was interesting for me, and that's usually a very, for me, a concrete example of saying how expanded this idea of languaging is. It's not just limited to the word, like you mentioned, Raul. It's beyond that. It's really thinking about language as a whole system, as part of the person, as part of, even thinking about audience, even thinking about the social context of the social practices involved in a particular context. It's all part of it. It's always in conversation with all of that.
Yeah, and actually, I'm just going to read a comment that popped up in the chat by Christian. He says, he moves between the two languages with a naturalness that seems to be speaking only one language. I don't know if you would, either of you would like to comment on that.
Yes, I mean, I agree. It's like very natural. It's seamless. It's why, and to think about it differently means that, if we start looking at separate codes kind of from this perspective of code switching, then we start breaking this organic and natural conversation into pieces. We start breaking it apart into pieces if we think about it as code switching.
Okay, now I'm going to jump in, because I mean, now that you brought that up, I really want to take you to the next question, because again, I'm not someone who's basically, I'm not going to call myself a translanguaging scholar. I mean, I'll have written things and I have done papers about it, but I'm not going to call myself a translanguaging scholar. I'm going to call myself someone who's, a literacy scholar who has included translanguaging in my repertoire. I'm not going to go, I'm not that daring to say, oh, I'm a translanguaging scholar. No, but okay, for a minute. So I'll ask the question quickly. And the question has to do with these two terms, code switching and code mixing. So the question, to help the students, what do those terms mean, like when people use them, and how different or how similar are they to the conversation about translanguaging?
Do you want me to
Yeah.
jump in first? Okay, well, I think for me, they're all related. We've certainly, in the field of bilingual education and linguistics, we've kind of built on the research, right? So we can't discount the term code switching or code mixing, because when they came out, it offered us an understanding about bilingualism that we didn't have before. So when we think about the research of code switching and code mixing, um, it was a lot grounded on this idea of disrupting the stigma of students mixing or going from shuttling between languages, right? So I appreciate that piece. I appreciate the piece that, you know, we started seeing how valuable in how much it takes for a student or bilingual person to do code switching, right? It's an advanced mechanism. It has rules. It's governed by rules. It's not just something that out of thin air. And historically, we've seen how Spanglish or any other mixture of languages, we've seen them as, you know, that's a sign of you don't know either one. But when this research came about, you know, it was about disrupting that negative or deficit perspective. It was really about showing how strategic bilinguals are or multilinguals are, how they were really thoughtful about the ways they use language, and how it is very much governed by structures and rules. It's not just, you know, you can't just code switch in a certain, you have to follow certain rules to be able to make it sound appropriate, to be able to make sense, to be able to have it make sense. As a bilingual myself, I grew up seeing myself as someone who did code switching, and you know, and I knew the perspective, you know, going back to Mexico and the US, I knew the stigma of me doing code switching in front of people in Mexico or in the US. And in a lot of times I couldn't do that in front of certain people because, you know, they held me to a standard form of Spanish or a standard form of English. But it was part of my community, and it was natural, and it was seamless, and it was organic when I was allowed to use it, or when I allowed myself to use it. But I do see how the research of code switching and code mixing, whether it's in oral, written forms, how it's provided the foundation and the groundwork for translanguaging to come about and really change the direction of our research, of education, just in the way we understand bilinguals overall. I think it's informed, and it continues to inform us in a lot of ways. I'm gonna take off, Raul. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you. Thank you so
Sorry
much,
it
Idalia.
took longer.
No. We understand. I mean, right now, these are crazy times. And the fact that you were able to squeeze in these minutes in within already crazy agendas and really crazy schedules that we have, it's much appreciated. I mean, you and I we still have a lot of things to talk about.
Yes.
And an APA manual that I have to collect. So.
And you know, feel free to share my information if there's something I can do, or
Absolutely.
question they might have. Feel free to just send me an email.
Absolutely.
It was nice to meet you all.
Thank you, Idalia.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
Idalia.
Bye.
All right, Zhonfeng, so we want to continue the
Sure. The conversation around translanguaging, code switching, code mixing.
Yeah,
Well,
yeah.
yeah. So my understanding is based on what I have been read about. You know, there's definitely a lot of theoretical debates around these terms: translanguaging, code switching, code mixing. And I want to first also, like what Idalia just said, first acknowledge they all valuable scholarship and keep contributing to our field. And also, no one term is trying to replace another term. I think they are all valuable terms that put our field, especially bilingual education, OTSO field forward. And so I think one similarity all these terms trying to describe is sort of this kind of language mixing behavior, this kind of language practices, regardless how you name it, code switching, code meshing, or translanguaging, is how people mesh all the codes together to make sense, to communicate. But I think the major difference to me is the theoretical lens is different when we look at how people make sense or how people communicate. So I think code switching, so if you look at the term code switching, it's switched between two or more codes. So I think code switching is still sort of, to me, is maintaining this kind of named language categories. So when we describe code switching, we sort of always say, I'm code switching between Chinese and English, or I'm code switching between Spanish and English. So we still sort of like keep those languages as entities, so as separate categories. So, but when we talk about translanguaging claims that there's one integrated or unitary system in bi or multilinguals. And what we are doing is select different linguistic features from this one unitary system to make meaning, to communicate our ideas. So I think that's one major difference lies between these two terms, or even code mixing. So sort of, are you treating language system as separate or treat them as one integrated system? And another thing is, I think code switching, it studies language sort of from a structural linguistic point of view, because it always trying to explore, so what are the rules governing the how people mix languages? So why people mix language in that kind of way? And so sort of code switching is sort of a rule-governed language practice or language behavior. But translanguaging, when it approach language practice as analysis, it looks at language from a social contextual perspective, how people make sense, how people communicate using their whole body language and interact with each other. Gestures, all these multimodality intertwined together to communicate their ideas. So I think they are looking at language behavior from different analytical lens as well. And the third difference, I think, translanguaging, code switching, or code meshing is translanguaging, this notion has its very explicit social justice purposes. Like what I said, to empower people from language minority communities to legitimize their language practices, to try to disrupt this monolingual ideology. Translanguaging, like Nelson Flores said, is also a political act. So with strong social justice implications. So I think that is one thing also makes translanguaging distinguish itself from other scholarship in the field now. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, because I mean, as I look at this conversation, I always, and I saw Anna raise her hand, so I'll wrap up my comment and then we'll give her the chance to talk. It's this sort of, I mean, to put more in core context for the students, I mean, the move of translanguaging, and this move is kind of like moving from this traditional understanding. Well, Idalia and I, in some of the work we have started doing, we talk about this idea of kind of we treat languages like TV channels. So it's very much related to Heller's idea of the multiple monolingualisms. So it's like kind of we have argued that we treat languages like TV channels. Like each of them has its own place. It has its own content. In the content, if you want specific content, you have to switch to another channel. And if the channels for some reason they get crossed, then you say there is a problem. There's a problem with the broadcast. So we always separate that. Oh no! If you want to speak Spanish, you have to go to the Spanish channel. If you want to speak Mandarin Chinese, you have to go to the Mandarin Chinese channel. And oh, God forbid that Mandarin Chinese and English mix, because then there is something inherently wrong with you. And I think the other issue is how we break those circles of shame, when the reality is we're always doing all those elements. Again, we talked about in the presentation yesterday that there are words that are untranslatable. There are some words in every language, and there are words that you just can't translate because translating them is a definition, not a word. So what do you do in that case? It's better to just use that word. And I had that, but I'll stop here because Anna had a question and I want to make sure she can ask the question. Anna, go ahead.
So my question was, as you were speaking about the code mixing and the difference between that, I had a question about maybe in this field, is there research about how this mixture of language has enriched like several languages? Like for instance, I don't know if for you has Mandarin enriched English in somehow, or how, I don't know, we can use Spanish to give something to English and vice versa. If there's research in that field, I don't know.
I think Li Wei has done some research in that field to look at this kind of creative and critical language mixing to enrich both languages. I remember he has one article talking about Chinglish in the in a post-multilingualism era. So sort of we break down those language boundaries and try to mixing different language features to create a new sort of language that has its own rhetorical meaning and its own political stance. Sometimes we try to mix language to represent our identity and to create a form of resistance to a certain extent. So I think there's definitely research in that area. And definitely, historically speaking, all the languages, they mutually influence each other. So there's a term also called borrowings, like we also sort of borrow certain terms from a different language into our language, and then it gradually it evolved into our daily terms. It becomes part of the language. So I definitely think languages, they definitely mutually influence each other and enrich each other. Yeah.
And that is historical, Anna, and that is very much historical. If you look at the, I mean, we've talked about this in the class a few times, that if you look at the history of languages, you can trace how through different historical events, and that include trade, includes migration, it includes invasions, it includes war. Languages have brought things from one. I mean, you look at, for example, in the case of Asian languages, if you look at the major three, Mandarin, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese, you can see that there are moments or that the three languages have overlapped. And you can find influence of Japanese characters in certain Chinese characters, and you can see the influence of in the other way around, and how Korean has shaped its characters in relation to the connections with the other languages in the region. So it's not something that is so far-fetched to think that historically all languages have affected each other. I mean, again, sometimes the historical events that led to those exchanges are not desirable. English language is the result of hundreds of years of invasions from every corner of Europe. I mean, the history is right there. It's written. It's right there. How different tribes that arrived in Britain, they brought words, they brought culture, and that it started mixing. And how, in the case of Spanish, the fact that we had they had the caliphate for so many years in that peninsula, affected the way we construct Spanish today. And as we keep moving, languages are constantly playing with each other. And as we start looking at the case of English, I mean, I know, for example, the case of Singapore is one case that we study all, is the case of Singlish, and how Singapore, I mean, that you don't even say Singaporean English anymore. You just say Singlish because it became something of its own. It became part of something of its own identity. Could we get to the point that we can talk about Colglish? I don't know. I mean, I don't even know what to call. I mean, that we're gonna have Colombian English. We're gonna call it what? Colglish? I don't know. I don't even know. But it could happen, because that's one of the things that I've gotten to gather from reading about translanguaging is we really need to recognize the dynamic nature of languages. That one of the things that all these ideas of code switching, code mixing, translanguaging acknowledges, it's that languages are incredibly dynamic. That languages historically have never been static. I mean, if you look at the way, if you look, for example, in English literature, you go back and look at Chaucer, you look at Beowulf, and then you look at Shakespeare, and then you look at today's novels. I mean, you can see that the language has evolved in great deal over the past 600, 700 years, even in the past 50 years. The way our grandparents spoke their language is very different from the way we speak the language today. And it's very likely that in 20 years, we're going to have expressions that we haven't even thought about or considered.
Yeah.
I'm just trying because there is a little bit of sound interference on the street. Somebody apparently singing, so that's going to be interesting when the video comes up. Now, another thing I really wanted to talk about, because it has to do with this, it's how translanguaging is helping us rethink what we mean exactly by bilingualism. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that particular issue, Zhongfeng.
Mm-hmm. That's definitely a very good question and a big question, sort of.
Yeah, it is.
I think to me, first, the translanguaging sort of has brought us with a new theoretical lens to look at bi or multilingualism. I know some people even starting to critique the term bi or multilingualism, because when we talk about bi or multilingualism, we still sort of treat languages as countable, right? So you are speaking 2 or 3 languages, or I don't know, maybe later there will be another new term. I know Liwei has already coined the term called post-multilingualism. Post-multilingualism, which means is there try to break down those linguistic boundaries. So we already like historically speaking or currently speaking, we are already in this constantly language dynamic exchange era. And people always use multiple features from multiple languages, from multiple resources to communicate. We are not always stick to one named languages, even in our daily communications. So we sort of in this post-multilingualism era that we always draw upon different linguistic features to be creative and be critical. So I think first the translanguaging brought this new theoretical lens to look at language to languaging as a progressive verb, to look at language from a social practice, and to really focus on how people do bi or multilingualism instead of just analyzing those rule-governed behavior to sort of only look at language from the language itself per se, but look at how people perform language. So language is a performative act, is a verb, not just as a noun. That traditional people in bilingual or multilingualism field, though they will analyze linguistic structures. And I'm not saying those are not valuable research. We do need those kind of research continuing to look at from morphology, phonology, syntax, those kind of structure real. But also we need to sort of focus on just how people interact, right? Just how human beings use language. So from this social contextual perspective, and also Idalia also bring another notion of multimodality. So how we use different linguistic resources interacted with multimodality. The intersection between bi or multilingualism, between bi or multilingualism and multimodality, I think is another trending is another trend I think gonna emerge in a bi or multilingualism field. And I know Raul, we are already working on this trend. So I think that definitely are gonna bring some new ideas to bi or multilingualism. And that's theoretical lens. I think the second lens I wanna say is definitely they're gonna bring new pedagogical implications to bi or multilingual education as well. So translanguaging scholar field, scholarship, this field, we talk about advocating translanguaging also as a pedagogy in different classroom contexts. So how are you gonna revision classroom to moving from a monolingual bias to embrace a more heteroglossic lens, heteroglossic language ideology to promote bi or multilingualism, to promote bi or multilingual students' creativity and criticality in classroom. I think that's another also sort of trend in bi or multilingual field. Yeah.
Yeah. No, and I would go further. I mean that one of the things that all these conversations are really triggering is that very meaning of bilingualism and the treatment of bilingualism as this always. And again, Li Wei, as we have mentioned, he has discussed this at length about the taxonomies of bilingualism. I've used this work in that sense of you cannot treat bilingualism in the traditional way of, oh, you are able to speak two languages equally well, because that's usually the traditional understanding that, oh, that if you're bilingual, then it means that you are fully capable of speaking the two languages at almost similar level of competence, and then being able to do almost everything in the same level. But then I always say, no, there comes a moment that there is no, so you cannot have balanced bilingualism. And there comes a point, especially, this is my argument, that when it comes to the registers, to the more advanced academic professional registers, that sometimes bilingualism becomes a zero-sum game, that where you're gonna be a lot stronger in one language than you're in the other. That even, for example, in the case of academic writing, we bilingual writers, we can write in the two languages, but one language is if you look at the discursive patterns, one language is going to be far stronger than the other. And sometimes, funny enough, for those of us who are, for example, trained in English, the language that becomes weaker is the native language, not the second language. It means we're better writers in English than we are, for example, in Spanish or in Chinese or in Russian or the other language, because of the training, because of the life experiences, because of the academic and networks that we belong to. So it becomes dynamic in a sense. It becomes very dynamic in the sense that, no, bilingualism is not something that you can simply, oh, I have two certificates, one in each of them says B2. I mean, no, bilingualism goes beyond that. And bilingualism goes into validating what people do. Not even what people can do, what people do with however little or however much languaging they possess. And I think that's sometimes what's missing in the conversation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. Oh, off I said there is also a notion, I put it in the chat box, called dynamic bilingualism. It's just exactly what you just said. It's not we develop our bilingual competence on two balanced views, right? It's all dynamic, right? To develop our bilingual competence to a certain different extent on a continuum in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah, in that continuum means, I mean, that languages come and go. I mean, and that sometimes that bilingualism could mean I speak any two languages at some given point. Maybe I forget about one, I pick up a third one, and then maybe that third one disappears for a while and a second one comes in. That as your linguistic repertoire begins to increase, the way you play with those languages begins to change as well. And at some point there's a personal dimension to that, as in like, okay, what two languages are more important to me? Not necessarily the two languages that we can call quote unquote dominant, because sometimes I think that quote unquote dominant concept brings us back to those traditional and narrow-minded views of the bilingual. There is one question, and I know where Andres is going with this, and it's had to do with like the idea of translanguaging and gamification, and if it can work together in class. And if that happens, how would it help to improve the student learning process? You got any thoughts on that?
I think they could definitely work together in class for sure. Yeah, there's definitely, I can see by merging these two together or bring these two together, they're gonna bring a lot of exciting pedagogical possibilities to class. And I think teacher will be playing a very important role to how to strategically create those kind of spaces to help students to improve their learning outcomes. So to your second question, yeah. I think Raul, you might have a better idea about how to bring these two together.
Well, we do. I think it's part of the research we're doing right now at the university with the people, my team of gamer researchers, and it's this notion of, okay, let's look at what gamers do. Let's see what happens in the play situations, and how we can use some of that, and really not necessarily turn the class into a video game, because gamification has never been about turning the class into a video game, but in looking at some of the principles and how they can help us get students engaged in more close to their lives ways to play with language. And I think that's that would be that's a really long, really big question The short answer to TLDR is yes, they should work together. And I think not just gamification, I think what students do with social media, what students do with fanfic, what students do with comics, that all is part of translanguaging. Because one of the things that translanguaging does is validate multiple sources of language and not simply reduce language only happens in certain places, or language only happens in classrooms, or language only happens in countries that have given the language an quote unquote official status. Because there are so many language dynamics around the world that don't necessarily, they never got the memo that a language is official or unofficial in that country. Languages are coming and going, and they're not, languages don't, let me just put it this way, languages don't have a passport. Only language speakers may have a passport, but languages don't, which means languages just, they just travel, they just go places, and sometimes in unexpected ways. And I think all the discussions on translanguaging, and I tend to use in my own work the related idea of polylanguaging as this, the resource, this idea again, the resources that we have and the resources that we find, and how those resources help us make sense of different language constructions. And I think that is the beauty of these conversations about translanguaging, for example. It's the validation of what you have. Because there is one, and I really would like to jump in and hear your thoughts on this, because one of the things that we're, I think now more specifically in TESOL, which is kind of like what has brought you and I together, you know that there is this ongoing practice of outlawing the L1. This whole idea that students are sometimes penalized for speaking Spanish, or speaking, you can say, for example, like in China, Mandarin or Cantonese or any other language, and that you're given points for speaking English often. And this idea that if you're in the language class is 100% English all the time, I mean, the backlash, the residual effect of the direct method. What can we tell teachers about that? Because teachers are sometimes worried. I mean, from your experience and from your research, what can we tell teachers about how translanguaging really can benefit their students' learning process of the second language?
Sure, yeah. I think the first thing I'm gonna tell the teacher is, no matter how you impose this kind of monolingual structures in your classroom, like certain, English only speaking rule, students, they always gonna engage in translanguaging practices all the time. So this is just this is who we are. As a second language learner, we always draw upon what we already have to help us understand something new. Even though we cannot do that officially, openly in classroom. But I'm thinking about my own English learning experience. I will do that on my own, right? Like secretly, I will draw upon Chinese to help me understand English, no matter if the teacher has the rule or not. So I think one thing teachers have to understand. So I know Ophelia Garcia coined the term called translanguaging corriente, which is translanguaging current, just like the river. The water is always going to be flowing there in your classroom, no matter if you try to see it or try to pretend you're not seeing it. Translanguaging corriente is always going to be in your classroom. So as teachers, I think it is important to recognize that translanguaging is there and treat it as resources that you can and you should foster a multilingual space strategically to leverage those as resources to help students to learn a second language better. So, and another thing is, language is not just language itself, it's always intertwined with culture and identity, right? So when you shut down their ability to use their L1, you also sort of shut down their part of their identity. You try to ask them to pretend the person they are not want to be, right? So sort of this kind of, when you allow them to use their L1, they can also bring their full selves to your classroom. They can also start to cultivate this bi or multilingual identity, even to cultivate this asset lens themselves, not just treat them as, okay, I'm not good at English, I always speak English as accent, to always kind of have this kind of deficit lens. So I think that's my second point. The third point, I'm always telling language teachers, you are language policy makers in your own classroom. You have your agency, regardless how the microstructure have this kind of outlawing L1 in TESOL field. Teachers, you can play the role. You can create a more inclusive space in your classroom to help students to learn a second language better. Yeah, so I think that's sort of my quick answers to that.
No, and it's important, yeah, because sometimes there is this preoccupation that, oh, they're more, I mean, they have all these hours of English and they need to speak English all the time, because then we have this idea, we still have this assumption that they're never going to use it outside of the classroom. That is an assumption that, oh no, if they don't maximize the hours inside the class, then they're never going to use it outside the classroom. And then what Translanguaging is telling you is, no, students will find ways, just as students find ways to subvertively use the L1 in the L2 class, students are going to find openly or subvertly ways to play with the second languages in their everyday lives. What we want, and one of the things I think is important in this is, yes, you can emphasize the instruction in the second language. Nobody's saying, no, you as a teacher should be the role model, and you should always engage in interactions with them in the second language. But forcing the students sometimes in what become unnatural ways. And I've seen it even in this class. I mean, I always tell the students that this class is it's kind of a model for things, that when students are working in small groups, even here when we had breakout groups for sometimes students speaking English, sometimes students speaking Spanish, and whichever choice they go, because at the end of the day, whether the end product is going to be in the second language, the assignments they have to write, the lesson plans they have to write in English, however they get there, it doesn't matter as long as they are able to get the most of their ideas before they engage in the outcome. And I think that's important to really point it out, that policing language doesn't work. And I think it's important to take that you can take that. I mean, that taking a political stance in the case of language use means what is my stance about policing language in my class? And I think when you look at translanguaging as a form of advocacy, Zhonfeng, that's right. That's one of the questions we ask. What is your position? What is your stance about policing language? Are you? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. On policing language.
Yeah. So in the sense of, okay, are you really forcing the students to? Mm-hmm. Oh, you have like the moment you enter this room, Spanish is completely forbidden. And then you have when you have to start asking yourself the question, and I will even go as far as that goes. When you speak in English in your normal everyday life, do you speak English 100% of the time? Or do you occasionally throw in a couple of words in your native language because they have better meaning? Yeah. Or they mean, yeah, because there are, I mean, we always talk about the jokes about questions about how do you translate, for example, when it comes to food. How do you translate certain names? I mean, like in Spanish, we have names of the typical food. And the question is, how do you translate them? Like, how do you translate food? I mean, it's impossible, because whatever translation you give, it's going to create a different, I mean, when you see, for example, some of the typical food like arepa, which is basically, people should call it like a flat cake. But even if flat cake doesn't mean the same to me as the word arepa, because it doesn't convey any meaning. I mean, flat cake to me doesn't mean anything. Uh-huh. The other word brings, and I can imagine there are certain words in Mandarin or Cantonese that you can say, how do you translate that word? You get the case of food. There are certain, how do you translate that? Like you can yes, you can provide a set of words that would replace it. the question is, do those that set of words help create all this, the meanings and the memories and the signifiers that are part of that word? And sometimes by simply, chopping that or severing that link to the first language, we're also losing all those memories that can help messages be so complex.
I definitely agree. That's why I think my stance is definitely against this kind of language policing, this kind of act as teachers. Because just like you said, when you police a language, you are not just police a language itself. You are also shut down the space that students can bring their funds of knowledge, their memories, their histories, their personal dimensions, their emotional dimensions, related to part of to their L1, all their dimensions. They cannot bring those things, those valuable things, into the space when you police language in that space. So I definitely agree with that.
Right. Now, I'll just, before I open the floor to some of the students that may have questions. I'm going to talk about, in the case of you as someone who's doing a great deal of work in the field. Where do you think the discussions in the field of translanguaging is going next? Like, what is the next frontier in the conversations? I mean, based on what you've seen, your articles and the books you just recently published.
I think definitely one of the trend I'm noticing is this kind of translanguaging and multimodality interaction that we also talk about this in our today's discussion. And translanguaging gamification, right? This kind of multimodal resources, semiotic resources, how they can work together, right? To bring more pedagogical implications in L2 classroom or in bilingual education classroom. I think that's definitely another trend. I know some scholars are already working on this. I know, just throw out some names there. I know Li Wei for sure, and Angel Lin. She's another scholar. She has this term called trans-semiotizing.
Oh yeah.
Term. Yeah. So and we are working on it as well, for sure.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one of the trends that I'm noticing. And another word I just want to say is translanguaging scholarship is still sort of emerging and relative new compared to, let's say, code switching, right? This kind of scholarship that has decades of research, right? So I think translanguaging is just started to emerging and gain much more traction in the last decade, right? The last 10 years. So it is still very new and emerging, and people are still debating, critiquing, discussing, questioning about some theoretical underpinnings of translanguage concept and how we can make it the transformative potential of translanguaging to bring those more visible to classrooms. So I think that's definitely a continuing research topic that needs more people to research on.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a very interesting point, and I think I want to leave it on the records for the students to pay attention to this, because it's important when you are constructing conceptual frameworks, or when you are you want to, like, say, in the case of Osling, you're going to embrace a concept that it's something that's under development, and you want to contribute to it. A very important element, it's also take some time to read the questions, the concerns, and the criticisms that people may be raising. The concept of translanguaging is one that is still under a lot of scrutiny and under heavy debate. I mean, like, and there are people, I'm not going to say there are, I mean, some of the people who are read, I mean, they make critiques. I wouldn't call them enemies of translanguaging, but they are people who are very, very reflective, raising serious questions. I'm thinking right now, I think it's Jesper is one, and Jeff McSwan is another one, who have raised a lot of questions, and that they're worth, I mean, the questions they're raising, they're worth, it's worth listening to them. When we are adopting conceptual frameworks, it's very important, and I can see some a little bit of a larger reflection for the students. When you adopt a conceptual framework, don't assume a dogmatic position. Don't assume that is the concept you chose is the chosen one. in that strict sense of, I mean, I worry sometimes that some people may be taking translanguaging as, oh, it's the chosen one. Like, no, translanguage is a concept that is still very much under development. It's a very recent, I mean, if we kind of trace back the first work, I mean, the original work by Ofelia Garcia and Li Wei, that kind of like the one that kind of set the tone. The work is not, it's just a few decades, not even more than 2 decades. And that is very little time for a concept to, I mean, 15, 20 years. I mean, a concept is still, theoretically, a concept is maybe kind of beginning its adolescence. I mean, there's not infancy, but it's kind of beginning its adolescence. And it's important to always consider that the contributions that are happening, it's kind of like, okay, everybody who's adding things to the conversation, we're just building it. But that is one of the nice things I've noticed also about translanguaging, that it's one of those concepts that it's not becoming whatever I want it to mean, because I think some people are also being careful, and I will put myself on that list. I mean, that I'm careful not to let this concept become whatever I want it to mean, because that's problematic. And bilingualism is a concept that has suffered that particular problem. Bilingualism has become whatever I want it to mean for whatever purpose I have. And so I think people who are doing translanguaging are trying to learn from those lessons and saying, no, it's not whatever I want it to mean. No, there are, I mean, and we kind of try to figure out, okay, what are the rules of the game? And these are some of the rules that, I mean, if it falls within this particular range of things, it's translanguaging. If it doesn't, it's not. And we're starting to define what those boundaries are going to be, but very collectively. So I think I really think the nice thing I have come to appreciate about the conversation about translanguaging is that everybody, and I mentioned it recently, we saw on social media, there was this debate between Jeff Maxwell and Suresh Kanagaraja about the concept. And the debate, they went for pages and pages of comments on Facebook, and half the people on the page, or the translinguistics page, were basically just went for popcorn. Because I was following, I just went for popcorn, and I spent half an hour just reading the whole debate. And they mentioned articles back and forth. And it was like, okay, I need to go back and read everybody. But at least the fact that there are debates happening, and that people are not necessarily trying to that the disruption is trying to construct as opposed to destroy. I think that's also a very interesting feature of the work that is happening in translanguaging.
Yeah, I remember Angeline also said it takes a village to research a village. So it's definitely, we need more people. We need those kind of theoretical debates, right? To discussion, to further deepen our understanding of what translanguaging means and how we can really enrich this field to move our field forward. Yeah.
Absolutely. So I think, because class is almost done, we're just coming to the tail end of the class. So before we even dismiss, I wonder if there are any questions from any of the students. Remember, you're welcome to leave questions on the chat itself, or you can raise your hand. We have a few minutes, so we can still take advantage of Zhongfeng's presence here. So if you have any questions, now is a good time to raise those questions. We'll just give you a couple of seconds to either type them or raise your hand. And don't be shy, because you aren't. Oh, I think at this point of the semester, the students are really like, sometimes it takes a little bit to get, but I know they probably have more questions right now, and they probably have to, again, there is a lot of information overload these days, and we have to acknowledge that. Just before we end, Zhonfeng, any, like, in terms of you as a younger scholar, and the work you have been doing with translanguaging and your experience theorizing, do you have any advice for these young teachers out here who are beginning to develop their identity as teachers to starting to develop their identity as scholars about, okay, what's coming next for them? What is the world going to look like for them in years to come?
I mean, in terms of research trend?
Yeah, in terms of research and teaching based on your experience, yeah.
I think definitely from what I noticed, there's definitely a strive for multilingual pedagogies in the field, especially in second language teaching field. People are still trying to disrupt this monolingual bias in second language teaching field. So, and there's also a lot of debates that we already touch upon some of them today. Yeah, so that's, I think definitely we need more people to experiment with multilingual pedagogies in real life classrooms, and we need more people to research about those practices to see their feasibility, applicability, and practicality in classroom, to how can we really embrace a multilingual future of our classrooms to benefit more emerging bilingual student populations. Yeah.
Excellent. So yeah, with that, I think with the last word, we're gonna wrap this up. Once again, Idalia have to leave us a little earlier, but I really appreciate her presence here today. Zhonfeng, I appreciate you taking time from your crazy schedule and preparing all the preparations that I know you're going through for your incoming defense, which we'll know it's going to be an absolute success. There is no doubt about it. So thank you for giving us the time, for taking time to share, again, a topic that in Colombia is emerging, and that students should probably keep track of that, because there will be publications coming, I'm very sure, in the next few years, and more presentations in the topic in the local conferences. So it's important to at least have an introduction to that. I mean, this presentation was just an introduction. It's difficult to summarize 15 years of research in an hour. But I think Idalia and Zhonfeng did a marvelous job getting us introduced into a field that has a lot of potential, that I see intersecting with TESOL, I see intersecting with literacy studies, I see intersecting with applied linguistics, and people from those fields are already starting to inquire about this and see, okay, how we can incorporate it in questions like Andres' question about gaming research and translanguaging, where we connect them. So it's a field that it's going to have plenty of avenues for inquiry in the future. So with that, once again, Zhonfeng, my gratitude. Thank you for spending the time with students and spending time with me. Again, this video is part of the ongoing LSLP in session series that we have on our YouTube channel. So invite you to check this one out, reach out for comments, and definitely watch the rest of the incredible webinars that are part of this. So for everyone, the students, and for our guests and everybody, thank you very much. Have a really, really good afternoon. And as always, I'd like to say, during these crazy and unusual times, let's stay safe, let's stay connected, and let's stay together. Have a great good afternoon.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you, Raul.